Welcome back to Project X, where we're taking you on a journey with us to find private label product opportunities, teaching you along the way so that you can build your own business using these same simple methods. Now, in the last episode, we went over product sourcing. We got different quotes from the factories. If you haven't seen that episode, make sure to go back and check it out. Now, this is episode 8, and in this episode, we're gonna go over the basics of shipping. But this is gonna be a Tim-centric episode. So Tim, can you tell us what else we're gonna be going over in this episode 8?
Yeah, so we're gonna talk about shipping your products from the location of manufacture to FBA. Now, we can't cover all the different dynamics and potential shipping scenarios across the world. We can't do it. The truth is, most of the private label products that you or we or anybody else in the Amazon space are selling are probably coming from China. So we're going to talk specifically about China. And of course, that's where our test products are coming from also. So actually, they're not test products anymore. They're actually full-blown launch products. We're going forward with them. So the other thing that we can't talk specifically about, just because we don't have a lot of time, is setting up FBA shipments. Okay, so if you're into arbitrage or wholesale and you're shipping products from your house to your business into Amazon, that's not what we're talking about. Even if we're shipping straight from China to an FBA fulfillment center, we have to set up an Amazon shipment within your Seller Central account. We're not going to talk about that. The reason being, it gets so complex. There's so many variables. We don't have enough time. And this Project X case study is specifically trying to teach you how to find and sell and launch products. So we don't want to get too deep, but we're not leaving you hanging. If you need to know how to set up shipments within your Amazon Seller Central account, click the show notes below, and we've got some resources for you there, some different options you can look at to get that information. So what we are specifically talking about is bringing products from China to Amazon, and that's what we're going to cover in this episode.
All right, guys, I am your host, Bradley Sutton. I work at Helium 10 here, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Tim Jordan from the Private Label Legion.
Welcome to Project X. All right, now, if you want an in-depth written version of this episode, make sure to go to helium10.com/X8. That's helium10.com/X8. We like to start off our different episodes with a question. So the question of today is, you guys are either selling on Amazon now, or you're thinking about it. I think everybody who does or is thinking about it probably has some kind of fear either about the shipping process or logistics process. I mean, you probably still do have some fears about tariffs or a container falling into the ocean or something like that. So we're wondering, what is your biggest fear about the whole process of shipping and logistics? Let us know down below in the comments, and we'll maybe talk about some of those in our AMA, our Ask Me Anything episode on Friday.
All right, so I'm going to be honest with you. When I first started buying from China, shipping, logistics, import was one of the most confusing things and really one of the scariest things. I've made some really big purchases, done some crazy international shipments from China to Africa and places like that. And what I learned is that most of the fear that I had was not based on reality. And I say that because it was kind of unknown, and maybe sometimes, at least I personally, have overcomplicated some things. What's really great about the rise of solopreneurship and entrepreneurship, especially in this e-commerce platform, is there are a lot of businesses that are small, a lot of mom and pop shops, a lot of folks like us that are online selling alone. And the industry has kind of evolved to help us. And they've simplified things. There are great services that can basically get your product from point A to its final destination, point Z, seamlessly for you. So what we're gonna do is we're not gonna get in this episode into like the real fine minutia of all of the individual import processes, anything like that. Minutia. Yeah, it's just small details. Minutia.
You learn vocabulary here on Project X as well.
But what we're gonna talk about is a general basic overview with the intention of you finding a shipping supplier that can handle pretty much all of that minutia for you, those small details. But you need to have a large enough understanding and kind of grasp of this whole process so that you can validate these potential suppliers and you can understand some of the lingo and you can understand some of the different steps that have to take place throughout these shipping processes, okay? So today we're going to talk about some of the cheapest options and some of the more expensive options, so general pricing for different shipping options. We're gonna talk about transit time being how long a specific type of shipment or shipping movement should take. We're going to talk about the modes of transport, the two primary modes of transport being
air and sea.
Air and sea. And then we're going to talk about some freight insurance and a few other things that you need to kind of have a general understanding of, okay? So everybody that we see like in the Facebook groups and on the boards and places like that are always asking a different question about shipping. And there's a lot of talk about the different modes, okay? You've kind of done it yourself already. Bradley said there's air and there's sea, but we're going to break that down further. We're going to talk about 2 options for air, which is air express and air freight. And then we're going to talk about 2 options for sea or ocean shipping, which is LCL or FCL. And we'll talk more about those. I want to put a disclaimer here right now, okay? I'm going to try to give some information to the best of my knowledge, and I'm even going to throw some numbers at you. But Bradley, as you know, things in the Amazon, ecosystem of business change all the time, right? So you've been in this game a little bit. What are some of the things that you've seen in shipping that can maybe adjust prices or adjust schedules, the things that we're going to talk about? Any ideas?
One of the things here in California, I remember a few years ago at the Long Beach port of entry. So that's where all the ships come in, right? The dock workers went on strike. So everything was to a hold. And now all of a sudden we were paying storage charges and all these other fees because the containers were just sitting on a boat, somewhere. There's things like seasonality, like try and have fun shipping things around the time that an iPhone is released, and all those shipments are coming from China. Well, what's going to happen during that time is your prices are going to skyrocket for shipping because the real estate on the planes and on the containers is a lot higher. So guys, there's things that fluctuate all the time. So just be ready for this.
Yeah. Big thing that you need to be aware of shipping from China are holidays. The big one being Chinese New Year. This usually happens in February, about the middle of February, and it can last anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks. But because basically all of the business in the country shuts down, shipments are going to stack up prior to the holiday, and there's going to be a big backlog after the holiday. Also think about holidays here. Think of Q4, think of Christmas. Everybody wants to ship prior to Q4. So August, September, October, your ocean shipments start to get really backlogged and filled up, and the price can rise. If you're air shipping like October, November, people trying to airship stuff last minute, things can go up. Also fuel costs. There are things that happen geopolitically and all sorts of stuff in this world that can raise fuel costs up. So your boats and your planes, the cost is going to go up potentially on fuel. And then you also have to consider inland transfers. And here's what that means. I see people all the time in like the Helium 10 users Facebook group saying, hey, I have a shipment of this that needs to go from China to the US. Well, where in China? China's a big country. The US is a big country. So even if I can get a quote from Shanghai to the port of Los Angeles here by ocean, how far inland were those goods in China? Because that takes some trucking. And then when it lands in LA, how far inland does that have to go? Is it going to your warehouse in Iowa, which is basically the middle of the country, or is it, going to an FBA facility right here near LA? So there are some different variables like with inland transfers. So just keep in mind that what we're going to show you and we're going to tell you is a fairly safe assumption of generalized numbers with transit times and costs, but there's always exceptions, so don't take it as gospel truth. All right, so the first type of air shipping that we're going to talk about, it's the simplest and it's the easiest is?
I believe you said express was going to be the first one, right?
Express air shipping. So let's talk about that. Express shipping is what a lot of us are familiar with like UPS, DHL, FedEx, okay? These are very, very simple shipments for us. Generally, our supplier can pack a box, get it loaded up in a UPS plane or a DHL plane, and ship this over. It's generally always air shipment. It's very, very simple. However, it can be very expensive. Why is it expensive? Well, one package, still takes a lot of work. It still takes a lot of paperwork. It still takes a delivery driver going to pick it up, a delivery driver going to drop it off. And when I say the most expensive, there are applications where it's very, very reasonable, but generally speaking, the cost per kilogram, and trivia, how many pounds is a kilogram?
2.2.
2.2. The reason we use kilograms is because the entire world uses a metric system except us in the US. So for shipping, we always use kilograms. So 1 kilogram is 2.2 pounds. Keep that in the back of your head when you're doing your math. Generally speaking, for Air Express, you're looking at anywhere from maybe $5 to $7 per kilogram, depending on a few variables. We'll talk some more about those variables in a minute. All right. As your shipment gets larger, it becomes less efficient to use Air Express. All right. If I am just dead set on shipping air and I've got a 3,000 kilogram, 8 pallet load of stuff, we're probably going to get out of, the scenario of Air Express being a good option. But if you're shipping samples, if you're shipping a small quantity, if you're shipping, iPhone cases and you can fit 300 to a box and you're only ordering 1,000, that's a really good application for Air Express. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those applications and considerations here in a minute. But keep in mind that's number one of our 4 primary shipping scenarios.
So think about that. The coffin shelf, you think we're going to ship that air? Probably not. The axe, that's probably a big product. You're probably not going to want to ship that air. So phone cases, you mentioned phone cases. When I was in the phone case industry, sometimes we would ship it air. So why would we want to pay 2 to 3 times as much? Well, what if you really have a deadline, right? And you have to get it here at a certain time and you're not going to lose money, with it. So you don't want to go out of stock. Maybe you would do air, or you want to have something there right away to get the listing up and going. Remember, the more product you can get in a carton, it becomes less per unit for an air shipment. So make sure to keep that in mind. Bigger products, you're probably never going to want to ship air.
Yeah, so as your quantity increases and your order increases, we're going to start looking at maybe transitioning from Air Express, which is your DHL, your UPS, your FedEx. TNT is like a really big one internationally, not so much here. We're going to start looking at air freight. Now, air freight is generally hauled by dedicated cargo companies like Panalpina and Polar Air and those big companies like that. Also, they're underneath you when you're riding on a commercial airliner. So most of these big international planes have dedicated storage facilities in the belly of them for air cargo. And honest to goodness, just yesterday morning, I went to my local airport and I picked up a huge truckload full of stuff that was shipped by Delta Airlines. It was in the belly of this thing. It was an international shipment. Nobody knew it. So air freight, because it's not one small package, it's not being handled one time, starts to lower your cost per kilogram. The typical price range for air freight for many sizes of cargo, all right, remember there's a lot of variables, can get down to as low as about $2 per kilogram and usually floats up towards about $4 per kilogram, all right? Keep this in mind though, cheaper is not always better. The reason for that is, and we'll talk about this more later, but I'm gonna hint towards it now, very small shipments are not efficient for air freight, but also there's a little more complexity when it comes to air freight. So if I'm shipping Air Express and I've got UPS, DHL, it's pretty easy, right? I print out a shipping label, they come pick it up, it disappears, and it goes to where it's going, right? But air freight, you actually have to go through a legal import and export process. So it has to be taken to a port, so the airport, it has to be documents created for export, it has to be cleared for exportation, it has to be consolidated on a plane, it has to be shipped, and when it lands, it can land at any airport in the US essentially. It has to be cleared through customs and it has to have its own documentation. Generally, it has to have a import bond, right? And you can Google that to find out all sorts of stuff about import bonds, but you have to have an import bond. It has to be cleared through a clearing agent. All right, starting to sound confusing and frustrating, right?
I think so. You had me at bond. I was thinking bond, import bond. I'll have a martini, shaken, not stirred.
You can tell we've been too long in the studio. All right. So the great thing about, this changing ecosystem that I discussed is that more and more shippers that can handle air freight are offering door-to-door service. All right. So what's this mean? It means that all of those process steps are still occurring. There's still bonds being used. There's still import-export documentation. There's still port clearing and potential inspections. But one company is pretty much handling that. So for all intents and purposes, we as buyers can have air freight shipments brought to Amazon FBA. They can be brought to a third-party fulfillment center. They can be brought straight to my house, essentially, as if it were an Air Express. It's just done. Now, one thing you need to consider is that some of these air freight shipments can get large. I have personally shipped humongous, I'm talking 10 or 12 pallets at a time through air freight. And it might seem simple to say, oh, just ship that to my house or ship that to my business. But remember, these are big shipments. A lot of times after they land at the airport, the shipping company will put them on pallets and bring them on 18-wheelers. So you might need a forklift or a pallet truck or be able to handle these large quantities. So keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is when you're ordering door-to-door shipping, ask about duties, okay? Duties are pretty much always paid when products come into the U.S. Some duties are high, some duties are low. We've talked a little bit about the tariff trade war and stuff like that. Make sure that when you're getting a door-to-door shipping quote, you know whether or not duties are included. If they are included, that's going to be the acronym is called DDP, right? A DDP shipment. You can ask your freight forwarder or your whoever your sourcing agent or whoever's shipping this, ask them if that's included. Because what you don't want is to get a shipping quote, customize your entire budget based on that, and then find out that once it lands, you have to get these duties paid, which sometimes could be large. So use door-to-door when you can. Make sure that you can handle the shipment because sometimes it get large, and make sure that you either know what your duty rate should be or that you've got a DDP door-to-door shipment, which includes the duties. And in fact, the shipping quote that we're going to use in a little bit actually includes those duties. We can show all of you what that looks like. All right. Any glaring questions about air freight?
Not so far. Well, the question that I had was, what in the world did you air freight all those pallets for, and why?
Books.
Books.
It was books. It was pallets and pallets of books for a client. And I think the scenarios we were rushing for Q4, and the books were pretty small, so we could put tons of them in one case. But it was 12 pallets of books. It was a ridiculous, I think it was $40,000 just for air shipping. It was crazy.
It's like buying, that's like the whole jet was just for you. The whole.
It was,
my goodness, let me charter a plane to take my stuff around the country.
It was insanity.
Tim Jordan's a big baller, guys.
Not even my product, just for a client. All right, so now let's talk about ocean shipping, right? You called it sea freight. Sea freight, ocean shipping, it's basically all the same. The general theme is we're putting this stuff on the water. Why? Because generally we can reduce our shipping costs. Okay?
And it makes sense, guys. I mean, think about how, have you guys ever seen pictures of container ships? These things are gargantuan. I mean, a 40-foot container is big in itself. How many hundreds, or I don't know, it could be thousands of containers go on one of these ships. Now think about that space. You can't even put one 40-foot container on an airplane. I mean, especially if it's in the belly only. I mean, there's not enough room. So you can just see the real estate obviously is a lot cheaper when you're dealing with the ocean shipments, because the cost to get it here for the shipping company is a lot less than $40,000 airplane that you're having to buy.
All right. So there's primarily, and of course there's a lot of different scenarios. Like, do you know what a row boat is?
Row your boat?
No, not that kind of row.
Gently down the stream?
It stands for roll on, roll off. And I've done shipments with roll on, roll off boats where a giant tailgate drops down and you can drive like bulldozers onto these boats, right? There's all sorts of crazy stuff, but we're going to keep it simple. Luckily, as Amazon or e-commerce sellers, we don't have to get really complex, and we can narrow down the types of sea/ocean shipping down to two primary categories, which is LCL and FCL. You know what those are?
Nope.
All right. So LCL stands for less than container load.
Oh, I knew that.
I figured you did. And FCL stands for full container load. Let's first talk about LCL. This is when you have a shipment that qualifies for ocean, but it's not going to fill up a whole container. All right. The primary sizes of containers are 20 foot and 40 foot, and we'll talk about that in a second. But sometimes you have 5 or 6 pallets that's, you don't want to ship by air because it could be too expensive, but it doesn't fill up a container. So that's where we come across these LCL shipments. All right. Let me hit a few kind of talking points about this. LCL shipments are consolidated. All right. There is not a boat out there that has all these pallets stacked up on the deck of the ship. That's not how it works. The way it works is I might have 5 pallets, you might have 6 pallets, and somebody else might have 10 pallets, like Kevin, our awesome camera guy back here, right? And when all these pallets come to a port of, shipping basically where it's going to ship from, and they're all going to the same place, right? So all of us might send all our pallets to Shanghai, and there they'll get loaded in one container. And once that container is full, they'll put that container on a boat, bring it somewhere like LA or Oakland or even the East Coast, and they're going to split those containers apart, take out the separate individual shipments. All right. It's fairly simple. What's really cool about LCL shipments is right now there are a lot of opportunities where you can also consider them door-to-door shipments because shipping companies have gotten easier. The process has gotten smoother. Right now, you can even do LCL shipments from China, your factory, wherever it is, straight into Amazon FBA. Really, really cool how we've been able to reduce the cost in the industry increase the simplicity of things for us. But let's talk about some of those potential things we need to consider. All right, trivia. If I have a container full of all of my own product, how many individual shipments is that?
That's you mean you have
I have
the
a
full
full
container? That's one shipment.
Okay. If I'm shipping an LCL load and my stuff is in a container with 5 other people, there's 6 of us, how many individual shipments are in that container?
That's 6. There's probably 6 BOL, 6 packing lists, everything.
Yep. So let me tell you what sometimes happens with some of these increased liability kind of LCL shipments. If your pallets are in the same container as my pallets and your paperwork isn't great, or maybe they think that you're importing, unicorn hair beard brushes, which we all know unicorns are endangered, right? When that lands at the port, there's going to be an inspection. And guess what? All of our products usually get lumped into that same inspection, right? So you have to be a little bit careful about that. Now, what if in our shared container, your shipment is full of beard balm, right? And your containers leak? I promise I have had this happen, unloading other people's stuff at my warehouse, and the floor of this container is just covered in beard oil. You talk about a slippery mess. Well, that can damage other people's products, right? So although LCL is a great option, I'm not trying to scare you away. You just need to keep in mind there's increased liability. You might have a little bit of like complexity issues. There's also probably more transshipment points, and transshipment is where things lay over. So if you're flying from here to the other side of the world and you're stopping off at different layover airports, those are technically transshipment points. And it happens with shipping, because if I have a container that's all the way inland China and I put all my stuff in this container and ship it to me on the other side of the world, it pretty much goes straight to me, right? Mm-hmm. It's got a few stopover points, but there's really nothing crazy happening. The container arrives to me. If it's a mixed load, it's got to be consolidated at the port. It's got to be deconsolidated at port, put in other truck, shipped around, right? So there's more moving of the products, which could increase the shipping time a little bit. You're also more likely to have a box get damaged, or a forklift run the forks of this pallet, something crazy like that. The other problem is sometimes you have to wait for full loads, because the shipping companies are not going to ship a half full container from Shanghai to LA. They're going to wait for other people's stuff to get there. Now, the really, really cool parts about LCL is you don't have to buy a full container. So for a smaller ocean shipment, it's incredibly affordable. The other thing is you can ship straight to Amazon. I can take 6 pallets, ship them from my factory straight to an Amazon fulfillment center. It's amazing. It's hands-free. It's awesome, right? So any other questions about LCL? Anything I'm forgetting? Any other big talking points?
Just make sure, guys, if it is LCL, and like, let's say you're bringing this to your house, or you have an office maybe, or even a warehouse. These are on containers, guys. And so first of all, they're going to transfer them. If it's a full container, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But if it's on an LCL, they're going to put it on these trucks. So here is going to come a truck who's going to deliver this product that you ordered. They've got 6 pallets and there's no lift gate, like on the U-Haul trucks or something. They're expecting you to be able to get those products off. So I've had it, I've had warehouses before where we didn't have a lift gate. We didn't have a dock. We didn't have a forklift. I would have to depalletize those from the truck and hand it down to somebody just to get it off. So when you're ordering things, make sure that you have the facilities that can receive this kind of shipment.
Yep, absolutely. The next type of ocean shipment, you already answered this. Can you answer it again?
FCL, full container load.
He's a shipping pro. All right, so you already know what full container is. That's where we basically take the full container, fill it up, and ship that directly to us. Well, generally it's going to be a warehouse or someone that can receive that. I don't recommend shipping a full 40-foot container to your home. That could be a really, really long day, and we'll even tell you why that could be a long day for you. All right, so a few points to consider about full container load. We already talked about the transit times can be a little bit shorter. Usually your stuff isn't messed with as much. It's usually more direct. It's by far the cheapest way to ship. We're going to talk specifically about 40-foot high cube containers. It's 40HQ is the kind of acronym for it. Those are the most common shipping containers. Those are the ones you see all over the roads, all over the warehouses. That's the most common. You can get 20-foot containers. You can get open top containers. You can get non-high cube containers. We're going to stick with 40-foot high cube containers. So the volume limit, all right, that's usually what's considered first. How much stuff can we pack into this container? And I have seen factories in China that do amazing Tetris jobs, and like every square inch and square centimeter is full. It's amazing. The volume limit ranges based on what's in it, but generally assume about 65 cubic meters. All right, now cubic meters may be a new term for you, just like kilograms may have been, and we'll talk about cubic meters here in a second. It's the kind of metric term. We'll actually show you where cubic meters is listed on our shipping quote that we're going to show for the coffin boxes here in a few minutes. So generally assume somewhere around 65 cubic meters. I think that 40-foot containers actually go up to like 70, but you're never going to get every square inch. So volume matters, right? Most of the stuff that we're shipping is not that heavy, but don't ever let anybody tell you that weight doesn't matter in a shipping container. The large reason for that is the U.S. Department of Transportation. So here's what happens in China. They can tell you, and let's say these are pallets of books. These are heavy, heavy items. I've shipped humongous pieces of machinery in containers that there's a lot of empty space, but we were still like exceeding the weight limit. In China, the weight limit's really high. The boat doesn't care. The dock doesn't care. But when you put it on the back of an 18-wheeler, guess what? You're restricted by the Department of Transportation weight limits.
You guys have seen like different weigh stations on the freeway, maybe in the town you live, especially if you live in California, there's a lot of them. Well, you see it says all trucks exit. Well, what's happening there is they're getting weighed. And if they are overweight, they're going to get a worst case scenario, stop. They say, you can't go anywhere. You got to bring another truck to unload some of this stuff. Or number two, they might say, hey, they might give you a big fine to the trucking company. And guess who's going to get that fine? You yourself is going to get that fine. Yeah. So this is very important.
So usually volume is the most important thing to consider. Assume about 65 cubic meters, but make sure that if you've got something heavy that you're not overloading that container. Also, we're talking about heavy stuff. The most efficient way to maximize capacity in a container is called floor loading. You know what floor loading is?
Put it directly on the floor, not on a pallet.
Correct. So most of these 18-wheelers driving around are full of pallets, and they put 20 pallets on. There's a lot of empty space. When they fill containers, typically in places like China, they're floor loading it, which means they are hand stacking these boxes. That's how they get that Tetris, like packing. But if you go all the way to the ceiling of these containers with something heavy, guess what happens at the bottom? They get crushed, right? So when you're considering shipping through full container load, make sure that you're considering the packaging and the weight, and make sure that you're not going all the way floor to ceiling with something heavy and fragile that could crush the bottom. Make sure absolutely that you're considering that. Another thing that you need to consider when it comes to FCL, remember, big positive point, it's usually the cheapest, but there are some considerations we have to watch out for that could actually increase that price. So again, if you're using door-to-door shipping, you probably don't have to worry about this, but you need to be aware of it. Some things like extra costs could be inspections, right? And inspections can get pretty expensive if you don't have your paperwork right, if you're not declaring things correctly, if you don't have a good customs bond, if you're using a real shady shipper, right? Like an inexperienced shipper that's had a lot of problems before, it's more likely to get flagged. And this can add up costs. One is inspection cost. I have had inspections on containers, and this is very rare. This is not to make you panic and be scared of shipping, where a cargo container comes into the port and it gets x-rayed. And on the x-ray, they find something inconclusive. Like one time I ocean shipped a bunch of magnets. Don't do that because it wreaks havoc on an x-ray machine and they inspect everything physically. So what they do is they take that container and put it on the back of a truck and drive it to a third-party warehouse where this third-party company unloads every box by hand, gets to the very front of the container, opens up like 6 boxes, says it's all good, packs it all back in, puts it back on the truck, drives it back to the port, and then continues. Guess what? You have to pay for the inspection. You have to pay for the additional days that you use that container. You have to pay for that truck to move it back and forth. And it gets really, really expensive. So be very careful. Make sure you've dotted all your I's, crossed all your T's, just something to consider. Usually the exam rates vary based on if you're getting it's called a VAXIS exam, which is like an x-ray exam, or an intensive exam. You can get FDA exams, you can get some other things like that. So I'm just making you aware that these things exist, they happen. Make sure to talk to your freight forwarder, whoever that is, and make sure you're familiar with the likelihood of something like that happening, potential costs, things like that. But generally speaking, as long as you're using a good shipping company and you're shipping FCL and you're not overloading it or you're squishing anything or shipping leaky bottles of beard oil across the world, then FCL is perfectly safe. I would even argue it's one of the safest ways to ship because people aren't taking your boxes in and out, right? Any other questions about FCL, full container loads?
Nope.
All right, so let's talk about volumetric weight. Again, if you get a good shipping quote, you don't have to worry about this. The reason this matters is because everybody thinks they're an expert. All right? You guys have seen it in the forums and on Reddit and these Facebook groups. People post all the time. Hey, well, you see it, don't you? Hey, I've got an air shipment. My air shipment weighs 75 kilograms. What should it cost me to ship that? You know what I do every time I see those posts?
What?
I roll my eyes and just keep going because I'm tired of answering this question. No, I'm just kidding. All right.
That's not good Facebook etiquette.
No, it's not. Let me say again. So when that happens, what is your response usually? Or what do you see other people doing in response to that? They're giving estimated quotes, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't work, does it?
Nope.
And the reason is dimension matters. Volume matters, okay? All right, so imagine this. I've got a box this size that, well, maybe a little bigger, but a small box that weighs 5 kilograms. And we know that Air Express is somewhere around $6 a kilogram, right? So if it's a 5 kilogram box, $6, $30 to ship this thing, hypothetically. 5 kilograms. Now, what if I was shipping a box this big full of feathers? And this giant box only weighed 2 kilograms. At 2 kilograms and $6 a kilogram, we're looking at about $12, right? Do you think I can ship a box of feathers this big from China to the US for $12? No. Airplanes actually have this kind of breakover point where larger gets more expensive than heavy. And the term for that is volumetric weight. Now, every shipper calculates volumetric weight differently. I'm not going to show you a calculation because every shipper does it differently. But here's the thing. When you're getting a shipping quote, you cannot just say, I have 5 boxes and they weigh 12 kilograms each. You have to give carton dimensions. Use a good door-to-door shipper, very experienced shipper that can calculate that volumetric weight. And now that you're aware of it, you're not going to be shocked when you send information for a 50 kilogram shipment and their quote says 70 kilograms. I see people freak out. Oh, they're trying to rip me off and charge me for 70. No, what you'll probably notice on that quote is they're charging you volumetric weight, which means you tripped over to the size over weight threshold. And that really, really matters. So next time you're in one of these Facebook groups and you see someone saying, hey, I have 12 boxes and it's 200 kilograms. What's it cost to ship? Post in there and say, hey, what are the dimensions of the boxes? Then these shippers can actually give you a good quote. Right?
And then remember too, it's like you said, it's not standard. So get like 3 or 4 quotes. Sometimes you'll see, some people trying to take advantage of newer people and they charge a really exorbitant high price because they figure, oh, they're just going to get a quote from me and they're just going to go with it. So get a few 2 or 3 shipping quotes and then pick the best one.
All right. So now we have an overview of Air Express, Air Freight, LCL, FCL, less container load, full container load. All right. Quiz. I've got 2 boxes. The boxes are normal size boxes, weigh 10 kilograms each. I'm going to ship them from China to here. What's the best route to ship those?
Say Air Express, DHL, FedEx.
Air Express, DHL, FedEx, UPS. But we know that ocean is generally cheaper, right? So is it going to be cheaper for me to put those 2 boxes in a LCL shipment and send it to me?
I don't think so.
No, because there are some fixed costs, okay? Air Express generally has no fixed costs. They're not going to charge you just to do business with them. When you get into air freight, there are some fixed costs. Remember I said you have to have a customs bond, you have to have a clearing broker. LCL is the same thing. There's paperwork that's involved. Full container load, you get into fixed costs of container rental and drayage, that delivery truck and renting the dolly that the container actually sits on and port handling and all those things. So as we get smaller and smaller, the more expensive shipments could potentially become cheaper and cheaper, all right? So the purpose of me telling you this, and I'm not going to go through like a big graph or anything like that, but just consider like what we've got below this information is the fixed costs. Don't always assume that ocean is going to be cheaper than air because that's not always the case. As shipments get smaller, that's not the case. Don't always assume that air freight will be less than Air Express because if I only have 3 or 4 boxes, Air Express is probably going to be cheaper than air freight. And the same thing with full container loads. We said that full container loads is probably the least expensive, but assuming we can fill that, I'm not going to get an entire container for 2 pallets. So if the shipment is smaller, then the traditionally more expensive shipping route could actually be cheaper. Make sense?
Makes sense.
All right, so I know this gets a little bit complex and a little confusing. Here's the main point. We are showing you this, you're aware of it, right? We want you to be aware. That way you know that there are a lot of different scenarios that you need to consider. The only way that you're going to be able to navigate this potential complexity is to find really good shipping providers to just be aware that there are a lot of different variables and variations of types of things that can happen, and get a lot of quotes. Don't just send shipping information and say, hey, I need an LCL or I need an air freight. Let your shippers tell you the different variables, because sometimes, even if I don't fill a full container, an FCL shipment can actually be cheaper if it's 3/4 of the way full and just have some empty space instead of doing LCL. So get good quotes. Just be aware there's a lot of different variables, a lot of different scenarios, and make sure that you're padding, your margins a little bit for potential added costs that you're not anticipating. And the methods that we use to show products generally have really high margins, so you can cover those. All right.
Sounds good.
Anything else about shipping that we haven't covered? A real glaring one.
I would assume that the basic, advantage of shipping air is the time, and it's slower to ship on an ocean because a boat is slower than an airplane. My question is, how much faster is it air than ocean?
All right. So remember, we said that most of the things that we're telling you in this episode are generalizations. They're not always 100% constant facts. But here's the generalizations. Usually, Air Express, the most expensive but also the fastest, can generally be shipped between 4 and 7 days. Okay. Now, if your products have to be shipped all the way to an airport and it takes a couple days, and then the inland delivery takes a little longer, understand there's some variables in there. Holidays are going to stretch that out. Crazy things like weather grounding planes can stretch out. But generally, Air Express is 4 to 7 days. It's usually the easiest. Air freight, there's a few variables that can happen, but generally looking between, 10 to 14 days is fairly average. And that's usually from door to door. All right, so 10 to 14 days. So it's not that much longer to potentially reduce your costs from Air Express to air freight. Now, LCL, FCL. So ocean can kind of be lumped in together. There's a lot of variables here, okay? But generally, you're looking between 30 and 45 days is a really good average. Now, if things are held up at the port for inspections as they're leaving the country, inspections coming in, that can change a lot. If ocean liners are all full, if something crazy happens, it can stretch out, right?
If you're in California as opposed to Nebraska or something, obviously there's going to be almost a week difference there too.
Yeah. And let me tell you, there's this really big misconception about West Coast versus East Coast. We know that West Coast is closer geographically to Asia and China, but the shipping to the East Coast isn't necessarily that much slower. There's these boats that actually go through the Panama Canal and fire up the East Coast. I know shipments that frequently make it from Shanghai to the port of New York. And that's even stopping in Savannah and Charleston and all these ports along the way in about 30 days, where most average ships coming to the West Coast take about 25 days. So if you are in the East Coast, if you got a warehouse in New York, don't ship it to Oakland or to LA and then drive that sucker all the way across the country. Ship that thing through the East Coast lanes. The other thing to consider, there are some what's called fast boats, and they're a little bit more expensive. And actually, that's how we're going to be shipping our coffin boxes, a fast boat. They usually go from Shanghai to LA in about 22 days. Just a tiny bit more expensive. It can usually shave off 4 or 5 or 6 days, which is really cool. So that's the general guidelines for shipping transit times. Lots of variables, but I'd say 75 to 80% of the time, that's how it rolls. All right. We were going to mention something else at the beginning of the episode. Do you remember what it is?
We talked about the different kinds of freight. We talked about shipping times, insurance.
Insurance. All right. Most shipping providers don't talk about it, but that's why we're sharing with you right now this concept of insurance. So you can be aware of it. You can ask about it. It can be rattling around in the back of your brain next time you get a shipment to make sure that you're covered. All right. A few quick things. I suggest you getting your own shipping insurance. You can get your own policy. If the freight forwarder says, oh, that's okay, we can cover it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they aren't. But would you let just anybody get your auto insurance for you? No, you want your own policy so you can see what the deductibles and see what the coverage are, see what the limits and the liabilities are. You need to understand in your insurance where it starts and when it stops. So there are a lot of insurance companies that just cover your freight from the ocean port to the ocean port. But what about the shipping to the port and the shipping after the port to you? And what about when it's sitting at the port? It might not be covered. So make sure you understand exactly which modes of transportation and which series and sequences of that shipment are covered. There's also a difference between open coverage and single coverage. If you're shipping your first shipment, you don't know how well this is going to go, you don't know if you're going to reorder, just get a single coverage policy. You can get this through your freight forwarder. Just make sure it's an independent one. There's a lot of companies that you can find that do shipping insurance, and just get insurance for that one shipment that you're doing. If you're importing a lot, it's cheaper just to get a yearly insurance coverage, right? It's called open coverage, where pretty much anything that comes in is covered. All right, so the things that insurance typically covers are things like theft, and they call it pillage, which is a very 1800s word, but I like it. Hijacking. Look, people used to say that the pirates were gone until all those shipping lanes around Somalia. You remember all those a few years ago?
Tom Hanks has something to say about that.
Tom Hanks has to say something about that for sure. A damage due to mistakes. This is people driving a forklift through your pallet. This is things like people dropping containers. If your boat sinks or catches on fire, or your plane crashes, or if there's exposure to water. Exposure to water happens a lot more than you would think. I've seen some pretty big water exposures on some shipments that I've done myself, where these giant pallets of products are sitting out on the tarmac of the airport being transferred, and a freak thunderstorm comes and gets them wet. Or what if your container that's sitting on this boat for 30 days in the open is leaky, right? And water, every time it rains, just drips in, or the seawater, splashing up the container enters in. It can do some serious damage to your products. You need to make sure it's covered. Crazy temperature variations are usually covered. It's not something that we generally run into, but if we were doing like FDA products or food, or stuff that can melt, stuff like that, it needs to be considered. So if you are shipping cosmetics, if you're shipping something that has a low melting point like candles, find out if you can get an insurance policy for those in case they're exposed to extreme weather differences. Most of your insurance policies are going to cover your CIF, so your cost of the products plus the shipping, plus about 10%. And that's just kind of like a headache fee, right? They'll just give you an extra 10%. And make sure that you have really good paperwork. Listen, there are a lot of people that are upset about increased duties, tariffs. So you know what they're doing?
No.
They're shipping their products on devalued invoices, right? So they're declaring that their product costs less than it really did. What happens if that product's damaged?
Remember, your insurance is going off of that invoice price. So if your invoice actual value, you paid $10,000 for this shipment, but you're like, hey, I'm gonna just devalue this because I don't want to pay some high charge. I'm gonna put $5,000 on the invoice. Guess what? You're only gonna get insurance for that $5,000 plus 10%, not the $10,000, and you just lost half your money investment.
Yeah, so be very careful. Make sure that if you're using insurance, well, I'd say if you're shipping at all, make sure that your paperwork's in order. You're doing it, cleanly and legally, but especially if you're getting insurance, make sure that paperwork and the value is in order. All right, so let's talk very briefly about FBA. There are multiple ways to ship if you're getting your products to Amazon. You can go straight to FBA, or you can go to a third party. You can even be that third party. This could be a warehouse, or it could be your own warehouse, or your own garage, or your own house, or your own driveway. For all I care, I've seen some people do some really cool stuff just out of their driveways that's not even covered, right? But there are pros and cons to each. One thing that you need to consider is going to FBA is going to be faster, but it's not always better, is it?
No, I mean, sometimes, like, let's say you have you're ordering a full container in, but you know your sales velocity, and it's going to take you 4 months to get through that inventory, or 5 months to get through that inventory. Now, you had to order the full container. You want to save some money on shipping. You want to save some money on maybe an MOQ from the factory or whatever. But now it's sitting in Amazon for months and months. You're going to get storage charges. And those storage charges are sometimes pretty expensive. Now, if you have your own warehouse, I have a warehouse in the back of my house. We used to run a business out of a 2,000 square foot warehouse. It's free. It's my own warehouse. If I have my container or shipment come to my house first, and I only ship what I know I need, so I don't get hit with the storage charges, I could save a lot of money. Even if you're using a 3PL, which is a third-party logistics company to store your products, a lot of times it's super cheap, like per pallet, like 15, 20 bucks or so per month, yeah, which is a lot better than what you'd be paying Amazon for overcharges.
Yeah, so even though it seems like the best opportunity or option is to always send straight into Amazon, keep in mind that it might be better to park, especially a large quantity of potentially slow-moving products at a 3PL or somewhere else and trickle that stuff into Amazon. Also, what happens right before Q4 with pallets being delivered into Amazon? Remember we said that you can ship LCL, these pallets, into Amazon? What usually happens as far as check-in times?
It increases. There's a big backlog because of the volume of shipments that are coming into Amazon.
But what we've noticed is that partial shipments in Amazon, like UPS, generally don't have that backlog. So if it's right before Q4 and you're starting to hit that rush, even if you've got 5 or 6 pallets, shipping those 5 or 6 pallets of LCL straight to FBA might get hung up at the Amazon Fulfillment Center being checked in for a month or even a month and a half we've seen in the past couple of years. So it might be better to send those to a 3PL, let them break it down and send in individual UPS boxes or FedEx boxes directly to Amazon. All right, so we've talked about kind of the ins and outs of shipping. We're going to be shipping some of our own stuff, right?
Indeed.
And this is a really cool point in the case study because we haven't really shown you profitability yet, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it's hard to do because until we find the product that we want and then we source it and get shipping quotes, and then the supplier has to give dimensions and weights to the shipping company, and they might not be able to give them to the shipping company until they've actually produced the goods. So some of this stuff we estimate, and we've talked about some of these estimations that we've done based on purchase decisions, like, yes, we're going to go move forward with this. But now we can actually look at shipping quotes. So you know that we've moved forward with some different products. Let's talk specifically about the coffin box. All right, the coffin box, what we have right now on the screen is an invoice from the shipping company that I like to use, right? So there's a few things to note on here. One is payment, TT in advance. Keep in mind, most shipping companies, until you get established and have a really good relationship with them, they're gonna want you to pay in advance, right? You see the price terms as door to door. Remember I said I love door to door just because I know everything's taken care of. This is going by sea. And the reason it's going by sea is the shipment is 4.1 cubic meters. So I know that that's about 3.5, 4 pallets, depending on how they stack it. Way too expensive for air. And we knew that was going to be the case because coffin boxes are pretty big and bulky. And we talked about volume mattering, right? So let's see some of these other things. Sometimes the validity stretches out 30 days, sometimes stretches out 3 months, sometimes it only stretches out a week because they know that those shipping prices can vary so much. So you have to be extremely careful to make sure you know your validity period. The longer they'll give you, the better, right? What else have we got on here?
Let's see. We got the total weight here. We've got the, this is interesting here. Why is this, Tim, different than this right here?
Because even in ocean freight, volumetric weight can matter, okay? So it doesn't matter so much in the way that this was, completely quoted, but just keep in mind that this shipment, because these coffin boxes are really light but big, that volume is actually going to trump the weight even in this scenario. So even though our cubic meters is 4.1 and our actual weight is 365, we're going to pay as if it was 690 kilograms, all right? So this is just an example. It's not gonna really affect the pricing too much here, but it's a really good example. That's one of the reasons I wanted to show you this quote specifically. All right, so also make sure that you're getting individual line items on your quotes done so that you know exactly what's going on. So do you want to explain some of these?
We got the domestic pickup from the factory to the port. I mean, the factory is not sitting right there at the port of, where is it here? Shanghai, okay? It's probably inland, a couple 100 miles, could be 1,000 miles, who knows? It costs money to get from the factory to the port. So that's what you see here. $200 is that charge.
And mixed in with that $200 is not just the pickup, but it's a few things like, port entry and delivery fees and things like that. But because I have a good shipping company, they kind of roll all this in for me.
All right, we've got a kilogram quote here for ocean freight door to door, and that's $860. But here's a question. What is DDP? Dance Professional? What do we got going on
So
here?
DDP is what we talked about. It's the door-to-door shipping quote that includes duties. All right, it includes the duties. This is awesome. This is really, really cool for us because they have already calculated what these duties are. And with this product, there's really none. So they've just kind of rolled it in for us. All right, so one thing to keep in mind is that the unit price isn't CBM. It's because they're basically using volumetric weight on this. So it could be kilograms, it could be cubic meters. They could have gone either way on exactly how they quoted this. But if you're getting multiple quotes, that's the most important thing. You'll get apples to apples comparison of shipping quotes. So even though this is like a little bit complex here, it doesn't matter. If I'd gotten quotes from multiple shipping companies, which I did on this one, you'd be able to compare which one is best, right? So don't let the lingo scare you. Don't be worried if they're quoting by kilograms or quoting by cubic meters. It doesn't really matter. Just get apples to apples comparison. All right. So this next line item, I actually had our shipping company add even though there's no charge. Any idea what that is?
Wood goods declare and commodity inspection cost. That's if it lands. Does this happen in China or does it happen in the USA?
Generally, it can happen either place, but specifically where, like, especially wooden products can happen leaving China, right? The reason we put this on here is just to show you that sometimes some funny things show up. In fact, we know that our coffin boxes are wood, but they're painted. If they weren't painted, if they were raw wood, we'd have to deal with some fumigation costs, and we'd have to deal with a few other potential, issues, like having the wood inspected to make sure it's not a endangered species of wood or something crazy like that. So just keep in mind, you don't have to memorize all these. You don't have to know these. These should not be the focus of learning how to run your business. Use a really good shipping company and they'll include all this for you. The other thing they did, this next line item here, extra inspection fee in the USA. I told you that sometimes this could happen. I had my shipping company put it on here just in case it happens. Even if you get a DDP shipping quote and they're including door-to-door and duties and everything, they cannot control inspections. Inspections will always be extra. So if this lands and somebody with the CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, decides, hey, I want to check this out, and they charge me an $80 inspection fee, they will charge me for that. The shipping company will charge me for that, and I'll have to pay it before the goods are released. So keep in mind that inspections are always external of these door-to-door duties included costs. All right. Then another thing we have here, I had them specifically add this because this is a hang up for a lot of people. People freak out about this. Why am I getting a quote and then I've got to get this extra charge? Keep in mind that so many of these quotes are so competitive and they're so down and dirty and just like trying to be extremely, extremely inexpensive that any additional little cost that the shipping company has to take on is a really big chunk of their profits. So like in this scenario, what the shipping company does is say, hey, if you're going to pay by PayPal, we have to charge you an extra $45 for this amount because PayPal charges us. So if you get something like this and you don't want to pay by PayPal, you want to pay through a different transfer company or something like that, you can just say, hey, can you just remove that? I'm going to ship a different way, or I'm going to pay a different way. So just keep in mind that the shipping quotes can have a lot of variables. But for us, none of these line items matter. What matters is that total cost, right? So 1105, and we know that our total number of units is 500. So what does that bring our shipping cost to?
All right, let me pull up the calculator here. My computer-like mind is not so computer-like today. All right, so you said it was how much?
1105.
1105, and then 500 units, right?
Divided by 500.
So about 221. Now this is the shipping rate from the factory, technically speaking, to our door. Now, if it was to Amazon, that would almost be, most everything. But in the scenario, let's take the scenario. That's not what we're doing with the coffin boxes. We're going to send it to a 3PL actually. So then the cost from getting to the 3PL to Amazon per unit,
just based on experience, maybe 20 cents a unit if they UPS them in. And then we've got our additional cost that the 3PL might charge us. Now remember, these are going to be completely ready to ship into Amazon. So they're just probably going to charge us case quantity or something like that. So we're probably looking somewhere landed cost in FBA of $2.50 or $2.60, something like that.
All right, so let's take a look at Coffin Shelf, and I'm going to show you guys what we want to do here. So we're going to
look at this. You remember the black one used to not be in stock?
It's in stock, but now it's two left.
Only two left. So between when we first started finding this till now, the black has actually restocked. And what we're going to do now is we're actually going to break down these numbers because we did some hypotheticals earlier based on profitability. And now that we have all of these different costs, our shipping cost, our product cost, and you can see we've already kind of plugged this stuff in for you, we can actually look at what this number looks like. All right.
Okay. Well, this is the automatically what happens. By the way, guys, what I did right there was I clicked on the Helium 10 Chrome extension, the profitability calculator. You can do that when you have it installed. And it's pulling in all of the information from Amazon as far as this product goes, like what the dimensions are, what the weight is, what the shipping weight is. Guess what, guys? We talked about volumetric weight. Amazon also has volumetric shipping charges. So even though this only weighs 1.5 pounds, Amazon, we're telling you, Helium 10 is telling you, Amazon is charging you the same as if it was 4 pounds. And again, because the box is a little bit bigger, so it's considered large standard size. Now, Let's go ahead and leave this price here for now, but I know we're not going to want to do $31.
And the price that's pulled in here is just the product price. Remember, our competitor here, our future competitor, is also merchant fulfilling. So they have an additional $5 or $6 for shipping, right? So we could move this to like $37.55. But
Probably could, yeah.
Yeah, because that's what they're actually costing. But we'll leave it at $31.55.
Let's just say 2 months storage. We turn over our inventory every 8 weeks or so. Now, the unit manufacturing cost, we had gotten a quote in the last episode. I wrote it down here. $424. Looks like $424. So what you see right here, what Helium 10 is putting, is just an estimate. It's putting a standard 20% of the selling price just so that we can have something there. But obviously, if you're running this, you've got to put in what quote you got. We got $424. So I'm going to put $424. Now, here's where it gets a little bit tricky. All right, the estimated freight cost. There's different ways that we can look at this per cubic meter, per cubic foot, per kilogram, per pound. Now, I could have just taken that CBM price from that shipping quote, but we don't know if Amazon is kind of calculating that the same way that the shipping company who made it. So what I did was I actually just broke down that shipment. We knew what it cost per unit. So I'm going to go ahead and I did some calculations out. So what it's going to cost is $1.80 per pound.
And all we did was took that per unit cost. So we divided, the cost of the shipment and how many units there were. And then we took the weight of the shipment based on how many units there were and then came up with this number.
All right. So based on that, and it takes into consideration what the FBA fee is, what the 15% commission from Amazon is. I could put another random cost here. Like let's say I package something, or for example, if I'm going to put FBA stickers on over here, well, that's going to cost me maybe 25 cents per unit. I can just, put 0.25 right here per unit. But at the bottom line, let's just say, I don't have any of these extra costs. It's telling me that my net margin here, first 3 quarters, is $14 per unit. That's a 44% or 185% ROI. Now that's a lot.
It's pretty strong.
That means I got some wiggle room.
So keep this in mind. We're not looking at a unit or a product idea that's like super high volume. What if we only sell 500 units of these a month? Can we do our calculator?
Let's do it.
If it's $14,
okay.
I'm old school, I'm on my phone. So $14 times, what do we say, 500 units a month?
Yeah.
That's another $7,000 a month from a product that you're not going to have any competition on. Who wants an extra $7,000 a month? That would be nice. Now let's play with the scenario a little bit. Let's say that we really want to get this thing ramped up and do some volume to get that 500 units a month. We need to drop the price, right? What's like a good just consumer, yes, I'll purchase price point? Like, I don't know, $23.99, $24.99, something like that. We're still looking at some pretty serious, like 100% ROI essentially, meaning for everyone that you sell, you've doubled your money. You double your money every time you sell it. That's pretty stinking awesome. Now, this calculator doesn't, include PPC costs and maybe some other random costs that come up. But generally speaking, this is not too shabby for a black coffin shelf box, right? So what we were doing earlier, taking these kind of estimated costs, and now we're adding into our actual costs, we've confirmed everything that we knew to be true. This is a really profitable item. What we would probably do, and we'll talk more about the launch phases, we might start at a lower price to get us ramped up. Actually, we may not, because remember in our test phase,
what price did you have it on these coffin shelves on the test one?
On the test phase, I had them at $60. I listed them at $60 because remember, we didn't want to sell them, and we sold several units, and we were like position 3 or 4 organically. It was unbelievable. So this, we might keep the price up. But if you want to get real down and dirty and competitive, maybe you find a product where you're willing to go down to 50%, ROI or 15% margins, and then creep that price up later once you get good position. But that's how you use this profitability calculator. We also know that there's a lot of margin in here. So if something happens, like I get a $200 inspection fee, is it going to crush my business?
Nah.
No. If you are worried about a 2 or 3% increase in your shipping costs, your production costs, making or breaking your business, you're sourcing wrong. You're picking the wrong products.
Yeah.
There are so many products out there with such high margins that you don't have to get down in the weeds and the nitty gritty of this like 1 or 2% affecting, success or not success. Pick the right products, and you don't have to get into this minutia, the minutia of all these individual shipping costs and things like that.
All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode about shipping so far, but there is one thing I wanted to talk about is because we just did all of the calculations. The coffin shelf is great. We got a quote last episode from the factory. They're good to go. The shipping quote was good to go. On the egg trays, we're good to go. But, and I told you guys, we weren't pre-doing this. We're doing this live, all right? What happened with the axes, Tim?
Yeah, so we had a little problem with the axes, and I'm actually a little bit thankful that this happened, because one thing that I want to show all of you, the viewers, is that a lot of scenarios can happen, a lot of things can happen. If your one product that you're trying, something like this happens, don't get discouraged, all right? You see that of all the products that we looked at, we started with 5. We eliminated 2 because they didn't look so hot. I don't even remember what they were, the tortilla blanket and...
I've forgotten already. Yeah.
Oh, the some baby thing, the seeds. Remember the seeds?
The seeds.
That was a long time ago.
Yes. The party, baby shower party favors or something.
Yeah.
Yes.
So then we were knocked down to basically 3 products that the testing looked good. It looked interesting. All of the different scenarios looked good. We have to drop that one. I don't want anybody to get discouraged. And like I said, I'm glad you see this, because out of 5, we end up with 2. That's not too bad. Now, let me explain what happened with the axes. When we went to source the axes, the prices was great. You actually saw videos of me in China sourcing those products. Everything was great. There is now a rule importing products from China into the US where metal striking tools are being regulated. And the reason for this is who knows what. There's all sorts of stuff that happens, where basically when we went to source these things, we found out that from China, we could not import hatchets or axes. Now, if we had longer time to mess around with this case study and show you these different scenarios, we'd source it from somewhere else. We might source it from India. I actually found a supplier in Taiwan. They were just kind of backlogged. We could order these things from South America. We could order them from Europe. There's a lot of places we could order them. So just because we ran into a snag and we can't continue sourcing and shipping that product, even though we really liked it as a potential product, it's really good. Like I said, we can show you that things happen. Don't get discouraged. The way to defeat discouragement, like knowing that those tortilla blankets are saturated, or knowing that we can't import the axes, is make sure that you're focusing on more than one product, right? And the methods that we're showing you should allow you to do that, because you're not diving too deep into one product. You should be able to spread out pretty wide, because the MOQs are generally low, the investment's low, and there are just so many product opportunities.
Absolutely. And another thing he mentioned in passing was about how there was some backlog in a couple of the factories that could do it. Well, what does that tell you? That tells me that maybe right now, remember when we would look, it was like barren right there. But what could happen in the next 6 months is maybe there's a whole bunch of companies already ordering this product. So maybe there's nothing right now on Amazon, but hey, in a few months, that could be different. So that's another kind of red flag that you need to, look out for sure.
Yeah, and we knew that the axes were potentially the most saturated of all the products that we looked at. We still wanted to go through it just to kind of show you the process, show you that even things that are somewhat more competitive can still be very successful. But fate is making us cancel the axes. Like I said, if we had more time, we'd source it from elsewhere, but we want to move on to this case study and don't want to hold up this information for you. So as of now, we're moving on with 2 of the 5 products. We've got the coffin box and we've got the wooden egg trays. We're moving forward the coffin boxes. We've got stuff on the water. We've got it shipped right now. We're waiting for it to arrive. So I think that that now we're kind of in that phase where we can start prepping to sell these things and going through some of that work of looking at our PPC data and our other research data using the different Helium 10 tools and start to prep this listing, right? So I think that's probably where we're going to go in our next episode.
Well, these are going to be Bradley-centric episodes. This was all Tim. I got to kick back most of this episode. But now we're going to get down and dirty with Helium 10 and creating the listing. First of all, doing more research for what kind of keywords are going to go into the listing. And we're going to get into that listing optimization and understanding the anatomy of a listing. We didn't get too in-depth in that when we did our test listing, because it didn't really matter that we had all of the keywords in there. It was just for a test for that PPC. But now we're going to get really into the full optimization of the listing in episode 9. So if you guys want to recap again of this episode, make sure to check the notes. You can do that at helium10.com/X8.
So far, I'm extremely happy with the way this is going, because one, we get to show that not everything works. Remember, we went from 5 to 2. So that's not discouraging. That's great. That's still pretty good percentage, right? and we're going to be able to keep walking through this process. And I'm confident, especially based on some of the comments and things that we've heard, that this is really, really impactful for a lot of people's potential to launch new products and keep growing their businesses.
All right, thanks a lot, Tim, and we'll see you guys in episode 9 of Project X.